The weight of dreams. When Steve Harvey met the future. The answer hit the Family Feud studio like a thunderclap. Not loud, but profound. The kind of sound that reverberates through silence and changes everything in its path. 19-year-old Jamal Washington stood at the contestant podium. His young face carrying a weight that had nothing to do with his age and everything to do with the dreams of an entire family resting on his shoulders. Steve Harvey had heard thousands of answers over his years of hosting. Funny ones, shocking ones, answers so unexpected they became viral moments. But when Jamal spoke those 6 words in response to a seemingly simple survey question, something shifted in the studio atmosphere that would transform this episode from entertainment into something much deeper. Name something your family expects from you, Steve had asked, with his usual showman energy, expecting the typical responses that made for good television. Good grades. Maybe. Help around the house. Respectful behavior. The kinds of answers that would generate laughs and keep the game moving. Instead, Jamal looked directly into Steve's eyes, his voice steady but carrying an undertone of exhaustion that belonged to someone much older, and said, "To not disappoint them." The studio fell silent. Not the comfortable quiet of a commercial break, but the heavy silence that follows truth spoken in a place unprepared to receive it. Steve's smile faltered as he processed what he'd heard. The audience shifted uncomfortably. Even the production crew behind the cameras seemed to sense that something significant was happening. Jamal Washington stood there, in his carefully pressed khaki pants and navy blue polo shirt, clothing his grandmother had helped him pick out for this moment. At 19, he carried himself with the careful posture of someone who understood that every move was being watched. Every word weighed for its impact on people he loved more than himself. He was the first person in his family's history to attend college. The first to graduate high school without getting arrested or pregnant. The first to have teachers call home with praise instead of problems. The first to carry the accumulated dreams of 3 generations who had been told in countless ways that people like them weren't meant for more. The Washington family had made the 12-hour drive from East Cleveland in a borrowed minivan, all 6 of them crammed together with snacks, hope, and the kind of nervous energy that comes from knowing this could change everything. Jamal's grandmother, Beatrice, sat in the audience wearing her best church dress and carrying a purse that contained her most precious possessions. Her grandson's acceptance letter to Ohio State, his high school graduation photo, and a worn prayer book that had seen her through 40 years of raising children and grandchildren in a neighborhood where dreams often died young. To not disappoint them, Jamal had said, and Steve Harvey, who had built a career on quick wit and perfect timing, found himself completely unprepared for the depth of meaning in those simple words. Behind the scenes, producers scrambled to understand what was happening. This wasn't in their runbook. Game show contestants were supposed to be enthusiastic, entertaining, focused on winning money and prizes. They weren't supposed to reveal the crushing weight of generational expectations on live television. But Steve Harvey wasn't just a game show host anymore. In that moment, looking at this young man who carried himself like Atlas, holding up the world, Steve became something more. A witness to truth. A man who understood that some moments transcend entertainment. "Son," Steve said softly, setting down his cards and moving away from his podium. "What do you mean by that?" The question opened floodgates that Jamal had been keeping carefully sealed. His composure, maintained through months of pressure and expectations, began to crack. Tears gathered in his eyes as he looked out at his family in the audience. All of them watching him with expressions of love mixed with hope, mixed with fear. Jamal began, his voice barely audible over the studio's sound system, "that I'm the first one in my family to make it this far. My mom dropped out of high school when she had me. My dad's been in and out of prison since I was 5. My grandmother worked 2 jobs for 15 years to keep us afloat." The rival family, the Hendersons from suburban Phoenix, stood frozen at their podium. They'd come to have fun, maybe win some money, appear on television with their perfect nuclear family story. They hadn't signed up to witness someone's life being laid bare in front of cameras and strangers. Every morning when I wake up, Jamal continued, I think about all the people who didn't get chances. My cousin Marcus, who was just as smart as me but got caught up with the wrong crowd and now he's doing 5 to 10. My Aunt Sharon, who wanted to be a nurse but had to quit school when her boyfriend left her with 3 kids. Steve found himself moving closer to Jamal, drawn by something he couldn't name. Maybe it was recognition. Maybe it was the understanding that comes from knowing what it means to carry the dreams of people who never got to live theirs. I think about my grandmother's hands, Jamal said. And now the tears were flowing freely. How they're rough from cleaning office buildings at night so I could have school supplies during the day. How she never bought herself new shoes because my textbooks were more important. The audience was completely silent now. Even the usual rustling of papers and shifting in seats had stopped. 300 people held their breath as this young man unpacked the weight of being chosen, of being the one designated to break cycles and build bridges to a better future. Every test I take, every grade I get, every decision I make, I think about them, Jamal continued. I think about whether I'm worthy of their sacrifice, whether I'm smart enough, strong enough, good enough to carry all their dreams and not drop them. Steve Harvey, who had made millions of people laugh, who had hosted countless hours of television, who prided himself on always having the right response, found himself in uncharted territory. This wasn't about entertainment anymore. This was about the crushing weight of hope, about what happens when one person becomes the repository for an entire family's dreams of something better. Jamal, Steve said, his voice stripped of all performance quality. How long have you been carrying this? Since I was 12, Jamal answered immediately. That's when my grandmother sat me down and told me I was different, that I was the one who was going to make it, that everything she'd worked for, everything my mom had struggled through, it was all going to be worth it because of me. The camera operators continued filming, but by now everyone understood they were witnessing something that transcended television. This was a young man bearing his soul, revealing the price of being chosen, the weight of being hope incarnate for people who had been systematically denied access to their own dreams. She meant it as encouragement, Jamal said with a laugh that held no humor. But what I heard was responsibility. What I heard was that failure wasn't just about me anymore. If I mess up, I'm not just disappointing myself. I'm proving that people like us really can't make it. I'm wasting all their sacrifice. Steve felt something twist in his chest. This wasn't about academic pressure or typical teenage stress. This was about survival, about representation, about the unbearable weight of being the one chosen to prove that an entire community deserved better than what they'd been given. Jamal, Steve said, and his voice carried the weight of absolute sincerity. What does success look like to you? The question seemed to catch Jamal off guard. He paused, considering, as if no one had ever asked him what he wanted versus what was expected of him. I don't know, he admitted, and this confession seemed to surprise him as much as anyone. I've been so focused on not failing that I haven't thought about what succeeding actually means. I just know I can't be the one who breaks the chain. The Henderson family, their competitors in this forgotten game, had tears in their eyes. Bill Henderson, a successful accountant whose biggest worry was whether his kids would get into their first-choice colleges, whispered to his wife, I can't even imagine that kind of pressure. Steve Harvey had built his career on understanding people, on reading audiences, on knowing what would make them laugh or cheer or feel connected. But standing there, looking at Jamal Washington, he saw something that demanded more than entertainment. He saw a young man drowning in the expectations of love. Jamal, Steve said, I want you to do something for me. I want you to look out there at your family and tell me what you see. Jamal turned toward the audience, toward the section where his grandmother sat clutching her purse, where his mother watched with eyes full of pride and worry, where his younger cousins looked at him with the kind of hero worship reserved for people who represent possibility. I see people who believe in me more than I believe in myself, Jamal said quietly. And what do you think they want from you? Steve asked. Everything, Jamal answered immediately. They want me to be the proof that all their struggle meant something. They want me to be the one who makes it, who breaks the cycle, who shows the world that we're worth something. Steve nodded, understanding flooding his features. And what do you think they want most? Jamal paused, confused by the question. Success? No, son, Steve said gently. They want you to be happy. They want you to be whole. They want you to know that your worth isn't measured by how far you climb, but by the fact that you exist and you're loved. The words hung in the studio air like a revelation. Jamal stared at Steve as if hearing something he'd never guessed possible. Your grandmother didn't work 2 jobs so you could carry the weight of her dreams, Steve continued. She worked 2 jobs so you could have the freedom to dream your own dreams. Your family doesn't need you to be perfect. They need you to be yourself. Steve began removing his suit jacket, his movements deliberate and symbolic. The jacket was navy blue, expensive, tailored perfection. It represented success, achievement, the kind of life that Jamal was working toward, but feared he might never deserve. Jamal, Steve said, draping the jacket around the young man's shoulders. This jacket has been with me through thousands of shows, through failures and successes, through moments when I doubted myself, and moments when I felt on top of the world. The jacket was too big for Jamal's frame, but he pulled it tighter around himself as if it were armor. You know what I learned, Steve continued. Success isn't about carrying other people's dreams. It's about honoring them by living your own life fully. Your family's sacrifice wasn't wasted if you fail at something. It would only be wasted if you spent your whole life so afraid of failing that you forgot to live. The studio audience began to react, not with applause but with the quiet sounds of recognition. Sniffles, soft sobs, the rustling of tissues being passed between strangers who suddenly understood they were witnessing something sacred. But what if I let them down? Jamal asked, his voice small and vulnerable. Son, Steve said, his hands on Jamal's shoulders. You're 19 years old. You're in college. You're articulate, thoughtful, and brave enough to speak your truth on national television. You haven't let anyone down. You've already succeeded beyond what most people accomplish in a lifetime. Steve turned to address the audience, his voice carrying the authority of someone who understood what it meant to rise from nothing. This young man represents something beautiful and painful about the American dream, he said. He represents what happens when opportunity meets preparation, when talent meets determination. But he also represents the price we sometimes pay for being first. The camera caught Jamal's grandmother in the audience, tears streaming down her face as she watched her grandson receive validation she'd never known how to give. Mrs. Washington, Steve called out, addressing Beatrice directly. What do you want to say to your grandson right now? Beatrice Washington stood slowly, her aged body straightening with dignity and purpose. When she spoke, her voice carried the strength of someone who had survived everything life could throw at her and still believed in tomorrow. Baby, she said, looking directly at Jamal, I didn't work 2 jobs so you could carry my burden. I worked 2 jobs so you could drop yours. You don't owe us nothing except being happy. The studio erupted in applause, but Beatrice wasn't finished. You already made us proud the day you decided to try. Everything else is just bonus. Jamal broke then, the careful composure he'd maintained for years crumbling as he realized that the weight he'd been carrying wasn't his to bear. Steve wrapped his arms around the young man, and for a moment the game show host became a father figure, a mentor, a representation of what Jamal could become without sacrificing who he was. Jamal, Steve said quietly, his words meant for the young man but picked up by the microphones and broadcast to millions. Being first doesn't mean being perfect, it means being brave enough to try. And you've already done that. When they finally pulled apart, Jamal stood straighter, not because he was carrying less weight, but because he understood now that the weight was shared. That love doesn't demand perfection, only authenticity. That his family's dreams weren't his burden to carry, but his foundation to build upon. The game resumed eventually, but it was transformed. Both families played not as competitors but as supporters, celebrating every reactor as a victory for something larger than points on a board. When Jamal's family won the $20,000 prize, the celebration felt like more than money. It felt like validation, like proof that dreams deferred aren't necessarily dreams denied. 6 months later, Steve Harvey received a letter from Jamal. It arrived with a photo showing the young man on the campus of Ohio State, wearing Steve's jacket over his university sweatshirt, his arm around his grandmother, who was beaming with pride during her first visit to a college campus. "Mr. Harvey," the letter read, "I wanted you to know that I'm still wearing your jacket, but I'm carrying it differently now. It doesn't feel like armor anymore. It feels like a reminder that success isn't about being perfect for other people. It's about being authentic for yourself." The letter continued, "I changed my major from pre-law to education. My family was worried at first, thinking I was limiting my potential. But I realized that my potential isn't limited by what I choose to do. It's unlimited because I choose to do it authentically. I want to be a teacher in communities like the one I came from. I want to be the adult who tells kids they're worth something not because of what they achieve, but because of who they are." Steve framed that letter in his dressing room, next to dozens of others from viewers whose lives had been touched by Jamal's courage to speak his truth. But the real legacy wasn't in the correspondence or the viral clips that circulated on social media. It was in the conversations that happened in living rooms across America, where families talked about pressure and love, about dreams and expectations, about the difference between carrying someone's hopes and being crushed by them. Jamal Washington learned that day that being first doesn't mean being alone, that the weight of dreams shared is lighter than the burden of perfection carried solo. And sometimes all it takes to transform pressure into purpose is someone who sees your worth not in what you achieve, but in who you dare to become. Steve Harvey learned something too, that his role as a host could sometimes transcend entertainment to become ministry. That a game show could become a sanctuary, that the most powerful moments in television happen not when you follow the script, but when you follow your heart towards someone who needs to be seen, heard, and reminded that they are already enough. Today, Jamal teaches 5th grade in East Cleveland, not far from where he grew up. His classroom walls are covered with college pennants and photos of his students, reminders that dreams come in all sizes and all shapes. And hanging behind his desk, carefully preserved and occasionally worn, is a navy blue suit jacket that reminds him daily that success isn't about reaching a destination. It's about having the courage to take the next step, knowing that you're supported by love that asks for nothing more than your authentic self. The weight of dreams, Jamal learned, is only crushing when you carry it alone. When it's shared, when it's understood, when it's grounded in love rather than fear, it becomes the foundation upon which anything is possible. And sometimes, the most important lesson you can learn is that you don't have to be perfect to be proud. You just have to be brave enough to be yourself.